This is KAZU, Pacific Grove, Monterey Bay Public Radio. My name is Mae Brussell. The title of the broadcast is World Watchers. Before I begin the program, I want to say the views expressed here are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of KAZU's staff or board of directors. This hour, World Watchers, is made possible in part by Aries Arts in the heart of Capitola Village, serving Santa Cruz's consciousness for over 20 years. As I said, my name is Mae Brussell. This is program number 844 of World Watchers, February the 8th, 1988. There are always new listeners to World Watchers. I have a habit of assuming that you're old friends, that you've listened for years, and I go on that format most of the time. The assumption is ridiculous. I apologize. I don't go backwards for what we've done before, but I apologize for assuming that you're used to the format. The format is new. It's not like usual broadcasts. It is outlined, but it isn't written out because I want to understand and share with you without reading a script. It is very open and direct. If you have any questions about the speed or the names, write the names down. Bibliography sheets are available if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Mae Brussell, P.O. Box 22511, self-addressed stamped envelope, and it's Carmel 93921. If you want information on how to order back broadcasts, they are available going back from 1977 to the present. The broadcasts are available. I've been on the air since 1971, but that is enough to go back there. I would like to make the others available sometime, but they aren't yet at this time. So I do want to say that if you're new or if you're an old listener that used to listen and lived out of town and then moved in the area, I hear a lot from people who begin subscribing, who've missed the program for several years and want to partake of it now. Write to me and I'll tell you how to get the bibliography sheets or the broadcast. There are a few items that I want to run through quickly. They deserve a lot of time, but I'm going through them just quickly because I don't want to pass them up, and maybe I'll do more later. One has to do, the title of the article is Savage, Baffling Attack on a Couple in a Berkeley Home. A popular University of California professor and his wife were brutally beaten on their heads. The wife, both of them were left for dead. Dr. Robert Michel and his wife Barbara were she was in a coma. He couldn't speak, but his eyes were open. This was in the San Francisco Chronicle, February the 2nd, 1988. They were attacked at 3 o'clock by an assailant with a blunt instrument that was in their apartment, seemed to be known to them, severely beaten. Dr. Michel works in the laboratory at UC California in the Department of Immunology. UC officials said his colleagues were absolutely flabbergasted at the attack. And this is the important sentence I want to share with you now. Dr. Ann Good, vice chairman of the Microbiology and Immunology Department, said, "It seems to be totally out of the blue and makes no sense whatever. It seems to be an act of random violence. And these random attacks, all too often, hit people who are benefiting society." Now, in my 23 years of research, this is one of the few times that I have seen it expressed in writing by a friend of persons who've been attacked or even people who've been killed. The connections are not being made except for the major, if there's a major or minor, and that's impossible, but connections are made between the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, for various reasons. But if I have one contribution to leave for my 23 years research, I believe it is the compilation of books and articles of death squads in this country identical to El Salvador, Guatemala, Chile, Argentina, around the world, in Germany prior to World War II, in Japan prior to World War II. The death squads continued by the same people to wipe out the labor leaders, the voices of protest, the artists, the writers, the creative people in our society. And what I'm putting together in my files and hopefully get into some computerized form and make it available are those people who all too often are hit, who are benefiting society. The article said that in his busy research and teaching as a professor of immunology, he found time to bring into his laboratory minority and disadvantaged students from local high schools He was also instrumental in getting minority students into the Department of Programs at UCB. So he was working with blacks and minority. He was working on the immune system, and there's a lot of literature, more coming out all the time about AIDS being a genetically altered, a biological disease done by the government as a warfare weapon. The article goes on to say his backgrounds were at Stanford University, the National Cancer Center in Bethesda, Maryland, Scripps Clinic in La Jolla, and during the 60s and 70s he was known as press representative for the Faculty Peace Committee, a group of UC professors opposed to the war in Vietnam, and they were bludgeoned practically to death. I haven't seen an obituary. They may survive this, but this was just one day before the vote on the Iran-Contra affair. Another small article, and I do suggest you listeners from coast to coast or even in Europe or wherever, start saving obituaries and look at the age and see what the person was doing and scotch tape them to a piece of paper and save them for a few months and then send them to me. This was an obituary from the Washington Post. Travers J. Bell Jr., 46, founder of the only black-owned member firm of the New York Stock Exchange, died January 25th at his home in New York City after an apparent heart attack. There's a rampant epidemic of apparent heart attacks. He started the Wall Street security firm of Daniels and Bell in 1971 with $175,000. The company grew to the net worth of $15 million, specializing in underwriting securities of minority-owned businesses, and there aren't many of those people writing the securities for minority-owned businesses. Now, another subject that I've done on past broadcasts, and I hate to rush through this so quickly, but you can get the tapes going back to January 26, 1986, has to do with a company called Advanced Genetic Sciences that wanted for the first time in the history of their experiences or anyone else to test genetically altered bacteria on farms in Monterey County and strawberry plants. The operation was called Frostban. And I went to the hearings of the Board of Supervisors and had done homework on the people, the board of directors that formed AGS and the company, and realized that their links were very close tied to those of IG Farben, to experiments in Europe, and thought that this possibly was a way to test the immune system of farm workers, the Mexican farm workers right here in Monterey County. And they moved their operations out of Monterey County, but I based it also on information and documents I had that the Environmental Protection Agency had given permission to put a substance on material that Mexican farm workers were working with in the United States that could cause cancer, testing on how to give Mexicans cancer, and when somebody caught on to that, it was moved south of the border. This article is from the Washington Post, January 23, 1988. 17 Argentine infected by experimental vaccine. Organism was genetically engineered. 17 farm workers working in Argentina were working, the cows were given this genetically altered vaccine, and by working with the cows on the farm, they became infected through these tests that the animals were getting. The company that was doing the operation was Wistar Institute, affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania, with funding from the National Institute of Health, the same group that go along with AGS and the genetic testing. It was carried out by pan-health organizations. The combination of virus was intended to fool the body's immune system into thinking rabies was present and making a defense against it. Vaccine is normally quite difficult to spread, usually requiring direct contact with an open sore. But in this case, the Argentine Minister of Health and Social Action said that the serological study done on 17 people, they had a different degree of exposure and contact, and the people have developed antibodies against the rabies, allegedly, but they got it from just being with animals that were given this experiment. The experiment was carried out with the permission of the Argentine government, but it doesn't say with the permission of the 17 farm workers or more that got the consequences. Wistar was also charged with taking the experiment abroad to circumvent safety guidelines in the United States. That's exactly what I was talking about, how this is done here, but people in the United States catch on, they take it abroad and give these poor people and farm workers and the people not privileged enough to read newspapers and know what's going on, they do the experiment. The article says a still unresolved issue that is being considered by a committee of the National Institute of Health is whether the U.S. companies and researchers should be held to the same federal ethical and safety standards in such experiments. If you can't do them at home, can you do them overseas? Wistar got more than $3 million in funds from National Institute of Health to work on these vaccines. After looking into the case, NIH was ruled out that because the experiment itself was not paid for with government money, and I don't know the difference between National Institute of Health and government money, it wasn't subject to federal safety rules, and the NIH Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee decided to consider tightening their regulations. And again, Jeremy Rifkin, who was fighting AGS and is a stalwart fighter against these type of operations, done at home or abroad, an opponent of genetic engineering, filed a petition with National Institute of Health asking for an emergency investigation of Wistar. Now, there was a doctor that passed away this last week, and this is a typical obituary apropos of the subject I mentioned. He wasn't killed or poisoned, but when these people die and you read the obituaries, you realize we're the people from the National Institute, and I'm not making a broad collective, everybody, where some of them come from. A doctor named Thaddeus John Domansky, from the retired Air Force colonel, died last week, obituary, Washington Post, January 28th. He later, after leaving the Air Force as a colonel, worked as a research scientist and administrator of the National Institute of Health. He served 23 years in the military. He retired from the Air Force in 1966. Then he joined the NIH. He doesn't have a doctor's degree. It doesn't say MA. He retired from NIH in 1983 after serving as director of the National Cancer Institute. What expertise does he have? And he was in charge of research grants at the National Institute of General Medical School. He joined the Army in 1943, served in the Pacific, South Korea after the war. Later he was assigned as Chief of Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine, Chief of Air Force Epidemiological Laboratory in San Antonio, Chief of the Toxicological Branch of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. He retired as an Air Force member of the Air Force, colonel, and then takes these jobs and gives the grants. The way that genocide began in Nazi Germany was with the psychiatrists and the doctors. That is historically documented, and one of the problems in this country that we have had since World War II, when many of the Nazi doctors who experimented joined the Air Force and joined these institutions that were formed around them, before or after them. We have to separate we collectively. It's a wish. If I had some wishes, I'm not going to get it. But it is a problem. Maybe some of these candidates running for office should be asked the question, would you separate the military from the medical and have these people come from renowned medical institutions and be on the Cancer Institute and not come from the Air Force, from South Korea or Vietnam or whatever, and make the decisions? Because I fear that these are the people, National Institute of Health, that he's affiliated with. These are the people identified as sending these viruses and bacteria down on farm workers in other countries that can cause diseases. And what goes around comes around. What comes to them comes to us a short time later. One other quick obituary that I want to mention and can't pass up. James Thieberg, ex-envoy to Chile and to Nicaragua, dies. He was 57 years old. He had another apparent heart attack at Montego Bay. That's the home base of the organization Permindex, and William Stevenson still is alive there, a man called Intrepid from British intelligence that formed our OSS to become the CIA. This Mr. Thurberg was ambassador to Chile, 1982 to 85 with Pinochet, ambassador to Nicaragua, 1975 to 77 with Somoza. He was advisor to Vice President George Bush on drug trafficking at a time when the Iran-Contra drug connections lead right to George Bush's door. And he worked as an advisor in Latin America. He was trained also at Columbia University, Oxford in England, and then spent formative years at Heidelberg University in West Germany after the 1950s. The CIA was formed in 1947. He stayed at Heidelberg through the 50s and then went to Harvard and worked in Argentina in 61, 64. He worked under Juan Perón, Somoza, and Pinochet, and worked with George Bush, and he died a very, I think it's a young death, 57. in Montego Bay, and could be a very important witness to a lot of the things that are going on. And then one other item, Pat Robertson, maybe you saw this article, says that Planned Parenthood the purpose of Planned Parenthood is to have a master race. And he accused Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, of being an advocate of eugenics. She and her disciples wanted to sterilize blacks and Jews and mental defectives, and Pat Robertson is running on the campaign issue that to have abortions is to have selective eugenics like Adolf Hitler did, and he's accusing Mrs. Sanger, Margaret Sanger, of being an anti-Semite, anti-black. That remains to be investigated. The charges that Planned Parenthood is to get rid of the unwanted, or I guess the useless eaters, as Adolf Hitler talked about them. Now, for the remaining 45 minutes of World Watchers, I'm going to talk about something that is very, very important. It's been overlooked in all the Iran-Contra events since Mr. Hassanfuss landed in Nicaragua in October '86. There are books coming out about the Iran-Contra and hearings, and there's a subject that I've had on World Watchers last year regarding the stock brokerage firm of E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch. And I want to take you one point further now to maybe one of the most important broadcasts that I've ever had on the air, and I think every week I have the most until the following week happens. I want you to get a pencil and write down the names that I'm mentioning so that you don't get confused by them. I'll spell them out, and I'll try to go as slowly as I can and get this story to you because it is very, very important. At the time of Watergate, when the men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel, Martha Mitchell made the mistake, or did us a favor, by saying the mafia is in the White House. For that, she was slapped on the bed, injected with a shot, and died of a painful cancer a few years later. The discussion of Noriega in Panama, the headlines read, Noriega sold out Panama. Noriega sold out his country to drug dealers. And I'll do more about Noriega and Panama next week. Noriega sold out his country to drug dealers. And what I'm saying and accusing this evening, and I can give you the sources and the documentation, and I've talked about it for a long time, is that our White House, our National Security Council, the people running this show, they sold out this country to drug dealers, also to the Waffen-SS, but to drug dealers. Now, last year, on World Watchers, March the 2nd, 1987, that was about almost a year ago, this next month, broadcast number 795, and if you keep the bibliography sheets in chronological order, you will be able to reach this quickly. I hope when you collect them or save them, you do it that way. I had a program on why the White House Chief of Staff, Donald Reagan, had so much power in the White House, how he took control of the White House and the national security policies. And they were based on the drug connections of Merrill Lynch. Don Reagan was chairman of the brokerage house of Merrill Lynch, and he moved himself into Secretary of the Treasury and a Chief of Staff. And his connections to the drug traffic in Europe and the terrorism under the guise of anti-Soviet policy were the things that gave him this muscle. Now, I listed 15 reasons and connections of Merrill Lynch to the drug traffic. And if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope, I can send you this sheet. Number 13 was that Merrill Lynch Swiss accounts funded the Turkish mafia. Their money transferred money, cash, to the Turkish mafia. And this is from heroin sold in New York City and in the eastern part of the United States alone. That money deposited in the bank accounts, brokerage firm of Merrill Lynch and also E.F. Hutton, I'll get to that in a minute, funded Turkish mafia boss Yasser Masalulu. Write that name down if you have a pencil. Yasser, and it's spelled M-A-S-U, Masu, then Lulu, and this is a Lulu of a story, L-L-U-L-U. It's a mass, big Lulu story. And a year ago, I said that Merrill Lynch was putting money into the account of Yasser Masalulu, and that Masalulu was linked to Ali Mehmet Agca, the man who shot the Pope. I also listed the connections of them to Michael Ledeen of Iran-Contra fame and also the shooting of the Pope, to Frank Turpel, who trained Agca to shoot before he ended up at St. Peter's. Theodore Shackley, who was at Rome at the time, working with the Italian intelligence. The defendants in the Christic Institute, well, Theodore Shackley is one of the defendants. Frank Turpel was part of Stanford Technology Training Group. And what I said was that Merrill Lynch Swiss accounts went to Mr. Masalulu and were connected to the man who took a shot at the Pope. Now, a long listener to World Watchers, and he listens to David Emery and Niptek and their program at KFJC, gets Italian newspapers and translates them for us, and I've had some of the translations on the air. And he gets them from Europe and does a massive job for us so that we continuously know what's going on in La Repubblica, Corriere della Sera, and so forth. And an article that he sent to us several. One it comes from Italy, the trial of the pizza drug trial in Italy, that large trial that just ended, the pizza mafia heroin connection, had to do with heroin traffic in Italy. And then the pizza trial in New York, there were two of them, had to do with their sending the pizza through the pizza agencies in New York City, the heroin that was had been processed in Europe and was sent to New York City to be distributed in the pizza parlors. Then the pizza bosses would take their money and put it into Merrill Lynch and E.F. Hutton, and that would be sent over to Switzerland to buy weapons for terrorists. And the terrorists then would process more heroin out of Italy to the pizza connections in Italy to New York City, and they would sell the heroin on the streets, take their buckets of money, $1.6 billion, when the arrest came in New York, and there were massive arrests in Italy. And two of the main witnesses there, a man named Badalamenti, I did broadcast on him, and Tommaso Buscetta. Those were the two main witnesses that testified in Italy and testified in New York about the heroin from Europe coming to New York, the deposits going to E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch, and then back to Switzerland. And I had identified, as I say, last year, the man who got, one of the men who got the money, over $11 million, was Mr. Masalulu. So in the translation that Dave and I got from this friend, from the Corriere della Sera, this was in the pizza trial in Italy, dated June 18th, this past year, 87, but it takes us a few months for him to get the paper, for him to translate it, and send it to us. This is what the newspaper had in Italy. According to Paul Waradel, W-R-I-D-E-L, a Turkish dealer turned informant who now lives in Switzerland and lived there for a long time. He was in Switzerland. He now lives in Athens. He said that a man named Oril Celik, O-R-I-L, and then the other one is C-E-L-I-K. There is Mr. Celenk and there's Mr. Celik. I don't want them confused. Paul Waradel worked with a man named Oril Celik, who is living in Sofia, setting up drug traffic. Between 1981 and 83, that's the time when the Pope was shot. The Pope was shot in 1981 in Rome, May 81. From 81 to 83, Mr. Oril Celik, who is wanted for an attempt to kill the Pope, along with Agca, who's in jail, Celik used the name of Abni Masalulu, the same person, and he coordinated from his office in Zurich payments for deliveries of hundreds of kilos of drugs consigned by the Sicilian band of Greco and Santa Polo for the United States market. So knowing a year ago that the money went from E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch to Masalulu, it turns out that Masalulu is Oril Celik, the man who assisted Agca to get out of a Turkish jail and assisted him until the point when they were both together in St. Peter's Square. Now, the next article that came that he gave us from La Repubblica, July 25th, 1985, earlier in the arrest when Agca was being investigated, said that Oril Celik may have collaborated with the Drug Enforcement Agency, that he worked with the American agencies and made possible numerous arrests in Europe, including Agca's accomplice, Omer I in Germany. Now, I have an article from the New York Times, April the 1st, 1986. This article I'm going to share with you because at that time, Mr. Musalou, and I don't want to confuse it, was the man, 1986-87, that I knew worked with Agca, but I didn't realize he's the man that got Agca out of the jail, that he worked for the United States government, and that his money came from E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch. And the reason those agencies are important, and I'll go into that again for those of you who don't remember, Merrill Lynch's chairman was Don Reagan. And at the time the money was going to Europe, to the mafia and the Turkish opium dealers, this chairman of E.F. of Merrill Lynch was, 1979, was the chairman at that time. And then he went on to become the Secretary of the Treasury. And it turns out that the Treasury Department is supposed to investigate money skimming, money going overseas to mafia, and the Secretary of the Treasury's own brokerage firm was sending it over there to a man that was supposed to kill the Pope to escalate the Cold War. The New York Times, April 1st, 1986, said, a deposition was taken in Switzerland by Paul Warradell. That's the man that had been giving the trial information then and now for 2 years. He explained how pizza money from the United States went into Swiss accounts from Merrill Lynch to a Yasser Masalou. And at that time, we didn't know that that was Bekir Celik, the man who freed Agca and helped him. Warradell admitted collecting more than $11 million for this Turkish suspect, Musalulu, which means, again, that Merrill Lynch is putting money into Musalulu's pockets. The New York prosecution of the pizza connection claims that 22 defendants operated a mafia heroin ring in New York City. They laundered many millions of dollars, including $20 million, to Switzerland through the accounts of E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch. Now, George Bush's wife, Barbara Bush, her maiden name is Pierce. Her brother was, he resigned in a few months ago, just a short while ago, was chairman of E.F. Hutton. George Bush was former CIA director. His wife was allegedly in the CIA. Her brother was chairman of E.F. Hutton. The Secretary of the Treasury, who became chief of staff, was Merrill Lynch. And money was going from those two firms into Switzerland to Mr. Warradell. And he said in 1982 alone, $20 million was transferred from these firms to him, and Warradell picked up more than $11 million for Mr. Musalou, whose name is Oral Celik. $5 million went to his home in Zurich. Another $11 million was taken to another home in Lugano, Switzerland, and he was paid for the money for morphine base converted to heroin that fills the bodies of people in New York City who are getting AIDS, spreading AIDS, who can't get jobs, who are on heroin. It was coming in from this man to New York City, and then the money was going back right to them to buy guns for terrorists. The money paid Musalou was for 2,200 pounds of morphine base at one time. Paul Warradell was born in Turkey. He was a friend of Musalou. Franco Delle, and he testified in the trials in New York, would take bags of cash from E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch that they sent their own delivery, and in order to avoid taxes, the brokerage firm would take the money and secretly put it in Switzerland. In September 1982, and this is in the New York Times article that I have here, in September of 1982, and think of Don Reagan as Secretary of the Treasury and George Bush's brother-in-law, his brokerage firm's putting the money in. In September 82, Franco Delle had stopped going to New York City to get the money to put in the brokerage firms because an official of E.F. Hutton, that's George Bush's brother-in-law, is the chairman of Hutton, disclosed that the FBI, under William Webster, who's now CIA director, had disclosed to them and tipped them off that the FBI was getting interested in our account in the United States. Therefore, they decided to secretly transfer the money overseas. They didn't stop the money, and William Webster didn't go to the President of the United States and say, these two firms are involved. We better ask Bush about this. We better ask Don Reagan. What they did was tip the people off of what they were doing. and the Treasury Department is assigned to investigate these matters. I'll take a 1-minute break now because many of you taped this off the air. So I will continue. This is Mae Brussell, and it is the second half of program number 844. Now, I want to go into the Treasury Department, the White House, and the CIA. In 1979, E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch were already depositing part of the $21 million that would continue for 4 years into the Swiss account of Paul Warradell. In 1981, after Reagan was inaugurated, Don Reagan, chairman of Merrill Lynch, became Secretary of the Treasury at that time. Jim Baker, who was formerly the campaign manager of George Bush, former CIA director, whose brother-in-law is chairman of E.F. Hutton, Jim Baker became chief of staff at the White House. So the Treasury and the chief of staff could control everything the president sees, hears, reads, everyone he talks to. Now, during this time, these millions of dollars being transferred, and at least $11 million was going to a man named Oral Celik, the man who got Ali Mehmet Agca out of jail, and I'll go into that chronology in a moment. Now, the FBI and Treasury Department are assigned the job of going into the money skimming. There's a long article in the New York Times, November 5th, 1984, about Judge Kaufman's committee, and he said under these special acts, the Treasury Department or other federal law enforcement agencies must be responsible for suspects. They were supposed to account for 10,000 or more that leaves one particular operation, or deposits of 10,000 or more. And the first investigation is not with the FBI or Justice Department. The money laundering is with the Treasury Department. There was another story in the New York Times, November 5th, 1984, about the investigations going to the Treasury Department. And the Secretary of the Treasury was Don Reagan. So suddenly, after several years, Ronald Reagan is in office, and one day we're told that Jim Baker, chief of staff, decided, talking to his buddy Don Reagan, that they would switch jobs. So Jim Baker becomes Secretary of the Treasury. It's no better. He was the campaign manager. He was the loyalist from Texas that was the right-hand man of George Bush, the CIA director. So now Jim Baker watches the Treasury Department, and there's no investigation from the Treasury Department about Mr. Warradell or Oral Celik. And Don Reagan, the former chairman of Merrill Lynch, whose money is still being paid to these people in Switzerland to finance terrorism with a big T, he becomes head chief of staff at the White House, and the heroin profits and the drug profits are still deposited, but not visibly, by this gentleman, because the FBI has caught on. So they've sent messages through E.F. Hutton, we'll do it through telex or wire money, whichever way you do it, and they changed their operations. Now, in 1979, and the money started coming in 79, so this crosses over whether Ronald Reagan would be president or Jimmy Carter would be president. The country has been sold to the mafia either way, and Don Reagan and other persons were heavily funding the Democrats and the Republicans, so that they anticipated that Ronald Reagan might be president and they'd have a handle on it. But if a Democrat were elected, it's still an American problem. It isn't Republican or Democrat. Now, in 1979, as I say, the brokerage firms were funding as a conduit in many corporations like Ford or General Motors or ITT, our CIA used. In 1979, E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch were sending these millions to Bekir Select, a Turkish mafia dealer over in Europe. In February 1979, a man named Abdi İpekçi in Turkey was killed. He was the most prominent newspaper editor in Turkey. In 1980, Turkey had a military dictatorship put into power, and the liberals and the leftists are wiped out. Again, it's not coincidental. that they are erased so that they can't voice their intelligent opposition to this matter, Abdi Ipeke was murdered, and Ali Mehmet Agca quickly confessed, although he threatened later to tell who really did it. And the day after he was released later from the jail, he sent a letter to be published in a paper that he was going to kill the Pope, which was a total turn away from who Agca was. In July, Ipeke was killed, and Agca, Ali Mehmet Agca, the man who's going to shoot the Pope, with great care and handling, didn't kill him, but the Cold War could escalate. You didn't have to really kill him to get the propaganda going, and there was plenty of that. He was sitting in jail in February. In July 2nd to 5th, in 1979, there was a high-level military intelligence meeting in Israel, and Israel was funding Iran after the Shah was out, and you know the story of the Israeli involvement. I called our 51st state. A group had their first meeting called the Jonathan Institute, and it really was a military battle for the Cold War. That is what it was, and it cooked itself up in ways that were apparent later. At the meeting were 4 former chiefs of Israeli defense and intelligence, a coalition of people from the Committee on Present Danger, that think tank of the United States, and from the Coalition for a Democratic Majority. They make policies for the president. Attending the meeting were some people you know and some you don't that are important for terrorism and counterterrorism. Richard Pipes, Norman Potterhearts, Midge Decter, that's the mother-in-law of Elliott Abrams, Senator Henry Jackson, who died in 1983, Ben Wattenberg, George Will, Bayard Rustin, Claire Sterling, who carried the lie that Agca worked for the KGB and the Pope. George Bush attended the meeting, the former CIA director. He's at a meeting in Israel talking about terrorism while his brother-in-law's firm is sending money to Oral Select, the man who's going to get Agca out of the jail a few months after the meeting. Ray Cline was at the meeting, former deputy director for intelligence, still active in the CIA. Major General George Keegan, Jr., former Air Force intelligence. Brian Crozier and Robert Moss from Great Britain, the MI6, long assets of the CIA. Arnaud de Borchgrave, another asset of the CIA, the editor of Reverend Moon's paper. He was the one with Michael Ledeen that printed an article in the New Republic just prior to the election smearing Billy Carter so that Jimmy Carter would be discredited, and they had arranged, the powers that be, the Italian government, the Seize group had arranged Billy Carter's trips to Libya. Paul Hense, our CIA officer in Turkey, who could allow Agca to be sprung for this great terrorist act. Lord Chalfont from Great Britain. Jack Kemp, whose campaign manager currently is Sven Kramer, the son of Fritz Kramer. Benjamin Netanyahu from Israel, whose brother Jonathan was killed in Uganda at Entebbe. They set it up, this Jonathan Institute, for the brother who was killed, but Idi Amin and that outfit were also funded by the CIA, so they don't explain. Frank Churchill set up those activities, and they don't explain how counterterrorism or terrorism is set up by the intelligence. Ernest Otto Raymer, former Nazi from Germany, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Henry Kissinger, always the biggies, and Vladimir Bukovsky. They had a meeting, and even more, Jonathan Institute, our top intelligence from Israel, Great Britain, also from Canada, United States, our counterintelligence covert agents, had a meeting in Israel, July 2nd to July 5th. And then on November 23rd, a few months later, Ali Mehmet Agca was let out of the prison. He was let out by the Grey Wolves, this Nazi, neo-Nazi group that later were effective with helping the coup in 1980. A few months later, Agca was let out of prison, and at the trial, he had threatened to tell who was behind the murder of Ipeke, but that never was heard. Oral Celik, the man who was receiving the money from E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch, got Agca out with the help of Grey Wolves. He traveled to many countries. And then 1979, by December the same year, he went down to a training camp in Libya where Frank Churchill of the CIA was training Agca. Then he was given a one-way ticket to Bulgaria, where he meets a gentleman named Bekir Celenk. There's two names that sound alike. There's Bekir Celenk, and there is Mr. Celik. They have both were indicted for a role in shooting the Pope. Celik never made it. He was killed in a jail in Turkey, one of those, again, apparent heart attacks. Celik travels around. It was in the United States in Miami with Stefano Delle, Chiaie, the master of strategy, attention, and terror. Agca walked out of the jail a few months after this coalition of people got together, and they were to become the propagandists that the Russians and Bulgarians shot the Pope. They were the media events. They were behind all the stories, and he was sent to Libya and with Gaddafi, and then he was sent to Bulgaria, where he meets Celenk, and Celenk gave him $1 million, and Bekir Celenk was identified as an agent of the United States. So Bekir Celik was receiving money from E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch, and Celenk then met him like on a conveyor belt in Bulgaria, where he got $1 million, and then Agca went to West Germany, where he was with members of the BND, the Galen operation, and he was in Spain, and he traveled until he met Oral Celik again, money from E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch, and is in Rome in St. Peter's Square. Celik has promised him they have a getaway for this, and of course, Agca is arrested, and Celik is free selling drugs in he's still in Sofia. Now, there are a lot of job changes following this activity, and I'd like to note the job changes. The Associate Attorney General, Lowell Jensen, who was on to some of this, the FBI wanted the transfers, and he refused to name individuals in the E.F. Hutton case when the subject of money skims and moving money out of E.F. Hutton took place. And he was involved with covering up the check kiting and other scandals of Judge Kaufman's report. Lowell Jensen was made a judge. He's in San Francisco, made a judge by Ronald Reagan. Edwin Meese, who was chief of staff at the White House, and then Don Reagan moves over. He becomes the Attorney General. Don Reagan goes from Secretary of the Treasury to Chief of Staff, and a man named John Shadd, who was vice chairman of E.F. Hutton while that was going on, involved their fraudulent dealings, was named by Ronald Reagan chairman of the Security Exchange Commission. All of this within a time period, and a lot of this is described by William Safire in his column, some of these people who changed their jobs, and I keep track of them also. So that the story of these characters moving on to new jobs and covering up is one that I try to keep track and detail that for their silence, they get promoted with these other jobs. Now, to continue the story one step further, I hope you're following it now, and I'll go into the brokerage houses more in detail, that their money was going to a man in Switzerland who said that he was giving it to Mr. Massalulu, and in the course of the trial in Italy, the man who was receiving it, the Massalulu, turned out to be Mr. Celik, the gentleman who went to Turkey, escorted Agca out of the jail, took him on his way and turned him over to Frank Turpel, and then they sent him back to Sofia to Mr. Celenk, both of them defendants in the plot to kill the Pope, one dead. And now to go one step further. From L'Europa magazine, November the 28th, 1987, just recently, directing the traffic in the Zurich station, Zurich, Switzerland, the drug money, the super fugitive known as Avni Musalulu, and that is Mr. Celik, still doing his drug trafficking in Sofia and also in Zurich, Switzerland. Mr. Celik, the fellow that got Agca out, the European representative for Turkish family of Seal. He represents the Turkish drug family. He also works with the undisputed lord of opium in the Golden Triangle, none other than Kung Sa. Kung Sa has been the subject of a lot of tapes and radio programs and interviews with Bo Gritz. He was over with Kung Sa in Burma. He knows him very well. Kung Sa mentioned Theodore Shackley as a person that he dealt drugs with. Theodore Shackley was at St. Peter's and was in Rome with Mr. Pazienza and the Italian intelligence just prior to the Pope shooting. And also, Mr. Kung Sa mentioned Mr. Armitage, Richard Armitage, who's now been promoted the last week to take Fred Eakley's place and move up as deputy director of the Defense Department. Kung Sa was working with Oral Celik, the man who was helping Agca make that route until he ended up at St. Peter's. Kung Sa's real name is Chang Chu-fu. This is the newspaper in Europa. His career began at the end of the 50s when the fledgling government of Rangoon entrusted the army with the task of pacifying the uncertain borders. Dismissed for his ferocity, he had his personal barber hung and quartered for defacing a tree in 1956. Kung Sa established the Shan United Army and began his personal war. Now, he wants a separate state. That's what the tapes that Bo had were about, or the broadcast. He wants his separate state. He says these men send in $40 million a year of drugs into the United States, and if they could grow an alternate crop, they would stop the drug traffic, and the federal government, our government, doesn't want the flow stopped. A staunch conservative like H. Ross Perot went to Washington to the Defense Department to talk to Caspar Weinberger and Mr. Carlucci about Armitage, the second man in the defense, and his involvement with drug traffic, and they told him to butt off Ross Perot. And he's angry about that, of course, and he was involved in trying to get another crop going for this Shan United Army. This article from Europa, published in Italy in 1967, Kung Sa became an opium warlord. And remember how the war was escalating in Vietnam from 1964 on. Today, he controls 80% of the world production. A sworn enemy of the Kuomintang, he wants to unite all the major traffickers under one flag. He's already in touch with the Chinese triad, very dangerous. The Japanese Yakuza, also dangerous and part of the Ryosha Sasakawa Reverend Moon Group, and continues to work with a Turk known as Avin Musalu in an organization called Kintex, and Musalu is Oral Celik. So Oral Celik was working with Kung Sa. Kung Sa was working with Theodore Shackley, and I can't believe that E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch didn't know where the money was going, given this cast of characters that reappear and appear over and over again. And the Grey Wolves were working with Celik, of course, and with Agca. Another character then, whose name is similar, comes into this picture. His name is, write down these two names. One is Oral Celik, C-E-L-I-K, who worked with Agca. The other is Bekir Celenk, C-E-L-E-N-K, the one that gave Agca $1 million to shoot the Pope. Covert Action number 23, if you get that magazine, spring 1985, the entire issue is on the politics of the plot to shoot the Pope and the counterintelligence Cold War activity. And the important point about that whole issue is that when they went to press, they didn't identify that the funds for it came from the firm of the Chief of Staff, former Secretary of Treasury, or from the brother-in-law, the house of the brother-in-law George Bush, and being CIA director, he could give it to one of these firms. Covert Action describes the Turkish godfather of drugs, Abuzur Ergürlü, the godfather of Turkish drugs, and he in turn worked with another Turkish businessman, godfather of drugs, Bekir Celenk, and according to Claire Sterling, who also published Disinformation, and Paul Hentz of the CIA, it was through Celenk and Ergürlü that the Bulgarians directed the Turkish smuggling, and they received Bulgarian protection, and it was Celenk who offered to pay Agca more than $1 million to kill the Pope. Now, Claire Sterling was at those meetings of the Jonathan Institute in Israel, and the money was coming from America to Mr. Celik and to Mr. Celenk. That $1 million that killed the Pope, she's right, that it was given to Agca, and he traveled around in high style, but it didn't come from the KGB or Bulgaria. It came from the United States of America, and the profits that went into the Swiss banks came from all the junkies on the East Coast and I guess around the country, but involved with the East Coast. So Agca's money, that $1 million, could have come right through the brokerage firm. It was deposited, and this was in the court records. Many of the United States newspapers, and then the Italians carried the other side of it, What I'm doing is connecting it, and these brokerage firms were directly responsible for Waradel handing it Celik. Celik walking in and taking Agca out, turning him over to Turpel, putting him in Bulgaria so that the Claire Sterlings, who attended the meeting of the Jonathan Institute just months prior to Agca being sprung, say, oh, he's in Bulgaria. Therefore, it is a Bulgarian plot. And La Republican, March the 30th, going back to 1983. That's how far back, said the most surprising case. And these drug arrests took place, they were taking place in 1982 and 83 in Italy. The most surprising case is that Bekir Celenk, the Turkish merchant who for years enjoyed great freedom in Bulgaria and who is implicated in the investigation in the attempted murder of John Paul II, let it reach people in the Trento magistrate where his name came up that in the past he had even collaborated with an agency of the American government. So one, Celik was with the DEA, and Celenk was agency of the American government. It could be the CIA, it could be Office of Navy Intelligence, it could be NSC, it could be all kinds of branches that contact him. It doesn't have to be one, but he worked with the United States government, as did his counterpart, Celik. There's Celik and Celenk. A rumor, this paper said, although there's no confirmation, but a rumor comes from a source considered reliable. And they also worked with a Turk named Mr. Hermann, who was Henry R. Sand's business partner. And they were also members of the Drug Enforcement Agency that had ties to other American services. There was an arrest in Italy of Henry R. Sand's offices. That's when the Banco Ambrosiano scandal came down. That was linked to Paul Marcinkus, the Vatican banks, and the largest guns and drugs scandal in the world that had ever happened in Italy or anywhere else. Then the pizza trial was another arrest in Sicily. Arsene and one group up in Milan, the other in Sicily, and then they combined with common agents. And the point is that Celenk was part of American intelligence. Celik was part of intelligence. One got Agca out of jail, and he then would connect with Turpel and back to Bulgaria. The other gave him money in Bulgaria. Now, you don't have to be a communist to get $1 million in a hotel in Bulgaria. And then Claire Sterling takes it, and Paul Henze, the CIA agent from Turkey, and Michael Ledeen, Italian intelligence, working with CISMI, the Italian intelligence, and Francesco Pazienza, and Claire Sterling and Michael Ledeen and Paul Henze and Henry Kissinger and Marvin Kalb, and the media whipped up. The Russians shot the Pope because Agca was in Bulgaria and got money from Celenk. And the truth is that the money given to him came from New York City brokerage firms to Mr. Waradel and then to Mr. Celik, and Agca was passed around like a rubber ball. There was a long article that came out. CIA turncoat Frank Turpel tells how he trained Agca. This was published in the New York Post in May of '83. Agca went to a training camp run by renegade CIA Frank Turpel in 1979. That's when Celik got him out. And it gives the names of the people that he met and would work with, various names that you're not going to remember anyway. One of them is a Turkish drug dealer, Omar A., that was killed in Germany. Then Agca went to Europe. There was no Interpol look for him, a red alert. He had murdered another person after the editor-publisher in Turkey. This article says he went in and out of West Germany, into Switzerland on German trips. He was accompanied by members of the German BND, Reinhard Gehlen's agents. Gehlen, chief of intelligence for Hitler Eastern Division. The BND told the Turkish that they would not allow Agca to be arrested on German soil for the two murders he had done, that the BND had to protect Agca. And Agca, I believe, was sprung. He was going to get the death penalty in Turkey. They saw he was a roast duck anywhere, a roast turkey, a bad joke. And with the Jonathan Institute meeting and with the expertise of all our intelligence, counterintelligence defense, and a team of pathological liars and murderers attending the meeting, in July and November, in comes Celik and lets him out of the jail and delivers him, and then he travels He goes just to Sofia to pick up $1 million. He goes to Bulgaria, picks up $1 million, and he's protected by the German Gehlen agents. And then this article said he was well funded. He stayed in good places. He had generous amount of cash. You better believe it. And then after a few days, he was meeting with Abuzer Ergülü. That's the godfather of the Turkish narcotics trafficking business. Ergülü was a partner of Bekir Celenk, who gave him the original money. And the people at the CIA and Turkish intelligence, the MIT, and the British SIS and the Mossad had telexes confirming that Agca was meeting with Ergülü, who's a partner of Celik, and they confirmed where he was, and Ergülü's his network was one that had Agca traveling around successfully in Europe. And there are documents that are available, I guess, that are in this article that the British intelligence, the Turkish intelligence, the Israeli Mossad all followed Agca, which is consistent with that meeting in 1979 when they got their heads together and whipped up this big story, and they were aware that he was with Ergülü, that he was with various agents and was being transferred around, but they couldn't arrest him because they had more to do. And to conclude, I just want to cite one article, maybe I'll get back to it next week. This is Henry Kissinger blames the KGB for the shooting of the Pope. And Henry Kissinger attended the meetings of the Jonathan Institute. This is from Washington. Accounts have emerged so far that the assassination on the Pope was almost to no other conclusion than the Soviet Secret Service was behind it, said Henry Kissinger. As his logic, here is a Turkish terrorist, who shows up in Bulgaria. That's where he was told to go, which is not the normal thing for a Turk to do, as if a Turk can't go to Bulgaria. He lives in the best hotel in Bulgaria with $50,000 and a weapon. The weapon was supplied by someone in Germany. He travels all over Europe. It can't happen without the Bulgarian secret police knowing it, Henry Kissinger said. Kissinger continued, they must have concluded that they had to crush Solidarity, the activist organization in Poland. At that time in 1981, they must have thought the possibility existed that the Red Army would have to go on. And this is a case where the Polish Pope would have to be killed. They had to threaten him because he would oppose any Reds moving in into Solidarity, and he'd be a voice supporting the Solidarity movement, and it would be a psychological problem. Kissinger said he was told by Richard Helms, the former CIA director, formerly head of the CIA, that it all had the earmarks of a KGB operation. Asked the implications if the KGB wanted to shoot the Pope, Kissinger said, I take it we will never know more than we know. The Soviets will ruthlessly pursue their own interests. Our problem is whether in a nuclear world the Soviets, pursuing their own interests and we're pursuing our interests, can ease that potential and reduce the danger. You can't trust the Soviets. And that is Henry Kissinger, who was attending the very meetings of this counterterrorism operation. And then his media stooge, who's always followed Kissinger around, Marvin Cowell, presented on NBC what was a white paper, a whole hour program on the Bulgarians, the KGB that shot the Pope. He's the right-hand arm of Henry Kissinger, Marvin Cowell, who's now retired to teach journalism at Harvard. Heavens help the poor students. And he goes into a one-hour program that many of you might have seen or not seen. The Man Who Shot the Pope, A Study in Terrorism. And there was a large media barrage that went on of propaganda and books and interviews and television. And all of this was money coming from E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch to a man in Switzerland, Mr. Wardell, who was giving it to Mr. Celik, who got Agca out of jail after the Jonathan Institute meetings. And then he was delivered to Frank Turpel with a one-way ticket to a city in Bulgaria where he'd pick up $1 million, and the rest is history. Knowing that Mr. Musalu is Oral Celik makes a whole different change in who runs the White House and who was behind the counterterrorism and how they funded it and the propaganda that went with it. Now, in conclusion, I want to say that this program, this Our World Watchers, was made possible by Aries Arts in the heart of Capitola Village, serving Santa Cruz's growing consciousness for over 20 years. I don't know if I had the disclaimer at the beginning of the program. I'll put it again. The previous hour, World Watcher, has been made possible in part. I said that. I want to say that the views expressed here are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo's staff or board of directors. I can put that on both times. We'll take a 1-minute break now, and then you can call in 375-3082 and discuss what you have on your mind.